Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a very special returning guest, Dr. Michael Heiser, to talk with us about the parables of Enoch from his latest commentary, A Companion to the Book of Enoch, a Reader's Commentary, Volume 2, The Parables of Enoch, which covers 1 Enoch 37 through 71. So a very short, succinct title, easy to remember. Mike, it's great.
I tried to make it longer, but,
Yeah. Well, that's probably what the whole book is. Half of it is the title. It's great to have you back on the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks. It's like those 17th century books where the title's like 40 words long, like they confuse title with preface.
Right, right. That's how the preface was invented. So, for those who may not have read your first commentary, this is the second volume. I actually have them here. If people want to take a look. Excellent books. This is the second one, the one we'll be talking about today. That's the first one. For those who may not have read the first commentary, the one that we're going to be talking about is the second volume in a series. Can you give us a little background on the Book of Enoch? What time period did this come from? Who read it, and how was it understood in its own time?
Yeah, as far as the textual material we have, that goes back, let's just use round numbers, 300 BC. And the earliest stuff would be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Aramaic fragments. So that's where the date comes from. The book's probably a little older than that, somewhere in Second Temple period, which is the intertestamental period. So again, round numbers, 500 BC to 70 AD is the period. And the content, fits with a lot of other things in that period, but, it has some unique features that are shared by other books that, because Enoch is the most noteworthy one, scholars tend to refer to these other ones as Enochian. How original is that, So that's the time period. As far as the content, Enoch is an apocalypse, which is a nice academic way of saying the book is essentially saying you're all doomed. Whoever's reading this is doomed. It's the Revelation, like the book of Revelation, it's the end of the world, all this apocalyptic, imagery and themes and whatnot. And so that's Enoch, but the book itself is actually, it's kind of like the Bible in that how the Bible is an assemblage of separate books. And Enoch is like that too. There's at least 5, some would say, 7 or 8 separate, books or authorial hands in here. I mean, nobody really knows for sure, but there are enough differences between sections that's a working theory. And the first 36 chapters, which was the first commentary, is known as the Book of the Watchers because it really fixates on, okay, this is an apocalypse, that Enoch is telling you about. You're all doomed, but here's why. So it's basically the whole world is just, utterly depraved, and it traces the depravity of humankind not to Genesis 3. It takes it back to Genesis 6, okay, with what the Watchers taught humankind. And again, the way I like to put it is to more efficiently destroy themselves and those around them. So idolatry, astrology, arts of seduction, immorality, warfare, wanton, death and destruction. So all of that in the mind of not just whoever wrote Enoch, but lots of Second Temple authors can be traced back to the pre-flood events with the Watchers, the sons of God in biblical, parlance.
So can you give us an overview of the parables of Enoch, which is found in chapters 37 through 71? This is the focus of your latest commentary overall. What are these parables about? What's their purpose?
Yeah, so this is the second section, of the overall Book of Enoch. And it is different than the first because you do have these parables, like there's no parables in the first section. And the parables sort of explain again, what's coming and why. And so it'll dip into, the Watcher's story here and there. But the major focus is actually not the cause or, anything like that. It's really on the final judgment. And this is the section of the book that focuses on the Messiah. Because in Enoch, and especially in these chapters, the Messiah he doesn't come as like we think of in the New Testament as a conquering king and a savior figure, atoning death. There's nothing like that. This is all pre-Jesus. Rather, the Messiah is presented as the judge. Okay, he's going to be the judge of the wicked. He's going to vindicate the righteous, and then we're going to have the kingdom, of God, that sort of thing. So for people more familiar with the Bible, if you think Day of the Lord, again, this kind of thing where, the Lord returns, again, the wicked are punished, the righteous are validated, and that's the end of all things, and so on and so forth. So there's it's kind of like Ragnarok, lots of death and destruction and judgment. But on the other side of that, again, you have the righteous being with the Lord. Well, that's what this section of Enoch is about. And the parables get into who the Messiah is, and basically a profile, and also who are the wicked and why are they being judged, and then therefore who are the righteous and why are they, again, going to be with the Lord at the end. So the parables sort of explain the division. It explains the judgment. It explains, again, what's going to happen. And but the major focus, the reason why these get a lot of attention, is you have in this section of the book, you have a pre-Christian Jewish profile of Messiah that includes things that lots of critics of Christianity like to say were invented by the early church. And that is not the case. This is datable. There's a reference to the Parthians, for instance, in the book, which allows, the majority of scholars are agreed that this section of Enoch is probably about 40 BC, trickling on into the 1st century. But that's still a good half century before the earliest gospel, was written. So this is pre-Christian stuff, and you have things like a pre-existent Messiah. Enoch uses all of the familiar terminology: the chosen one, the righteous one, the Son of Man, the anointed one, Mashiach. And so it tells you, again, at least there was one strain of Judaism that sounds awfully close to the kinds of things that we get in the New Testament. The only thing missing is an atoning death, and resurrection. So it's like, think second coming, think day of the Lord, and that's your Messiah, when it comes to, the book of the parables.
Yeah, it's always interesting to read stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there's like this connective tissue between the Old and the New Testament, and it's really interesting to see how possibly some of this stuff might have had some influence. Usually when we as Christians think of parables, we think of the many parables of Jesus. Now, how do the parables of Enoch compare to what we're used to in the Bible? Are these similar, or are these just totally different?
Well, in terms of what literarily what a parable is, they're similar. They're going to be, they're going to be stories. Okay, there's going to be a story flavor to them that is going to convey, certain truths, which again is very typical for what we think of as parable. So, since we have storytelling mode, okay, in this section 3 times, 3 extended parables, that's why it gets its name. So it's a fair equivalence to draw.
Would Jesus have been familiar with the book of Enoch? Because immediately in chapter 38, a line jumped out at me. It might be a general line that was, used. I mean, we use it today. But it's talking about the sinners who are judged. It says it had been good for them if they had not been born. Yet that sounds really similar to something Jesus said about Judas. Is the idea that Jesus may have been familiar with Enoch, is that a reach, or are there some similar phraseology from the book of Enoch found in the New Testament, in the Gospels, or even in other areas of the New Testament that might tell us possibly even Jesus himself may have been familiar with this text?
Well, I mean, if we begin with the assumption, and I think it's a sound one, that what Matthew and other gospel writers, for instance, are writing when they have dialogue between Jesus and either his disciples or his enemies, that's a genuine representation of stuff Jesus said. I mean, nobody's going around with a tape recorder, obviously, and the synoptic gospels are different, but it's a faithful presentation. With that assumption, I think it's certain that he knew the content. And to me, here's the line that stands out is Matthew 25:41, where he's talking about judgment, just like Enoch is, and then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Okay, that combination that characterization and combination of the devil and angels with this lake of fire thing. This is the only place where the combination occurs. You get two of the three, later on in the book of Revelation, but you get all of those things in the book of Enoch. In other words, Enoch is sort of the pool from which that specific language comes. And so, again, if this is Jesus actually talking, yeah, I mean, this, it reflects very, very clearly, what's going on here. It's not the only example. On my podcast, Naked Bible Podcast, we actually did an episode. It's got to be 3 years ago now, on heavenly books. Okay, and the one we're familiar with is the Book of Life and all this. And then we did another one on this kind of language, and these are some of the clearest examples of where New Testament writers and characters, including Jesus, are actually referencing things in the book. Okay, maybe they don't quote chapter verse. I mean, Jude does. Everybody knows that the New Testament, at least in Jude, will dip into it explicitly. But what they don't seem to realize is that the content of the book is referenced a lot. It's alluded to a lot. And again, for my money, this is one of the most transparent examples of this, because you don't have this come from the Old Testament. You don't have this, spelled out. Now you have all the data points. Okay, there's the Satan figure in his realm. He's the realm of the dead, the underworld. And you've got demons and rebellious supernatural beings that are in this place. I mean, all the data points are there, but you never get it spelled out anywhere. Where they're all these things are collected and put in one place. But in Enoch you do, and in Matthew 25 you do.
So back in that time, in the time of Jesus, how did they view the book of Enoch? Did they view this as scripture? Was it a part of their canon, or was it just a history book to them? How would they have viewed this, and how does that inform how we should view it today?
Yeah, it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community did not consider the book of Enoch canonical. The exception to that are the people who lived at Qumran, and the best bet for them is still the Essenes, even though there are niggly problems, with it. But that's still the best bet. They cite, there's a couple lines of evidence for how they felt about the book. They cite it with formulaic language, thus it is written, or as it is written, or, here's the interpretation. They use certain phrases when they are quoting, books that we, in today's world would, recognize as canonical, whether we're Protestant or Catholic. And they do that for those books and for Enoch. They also do it for the Temple Scroll, which is a kind of a sectarian document. The other thing they do is they produce commentaries, just like we have today, commentaries on biblical books. And the people at Qumran, the scribes, they only wrote commentaries on biblical books and Enoch, and the Temple Scroll. So it tells you that those two things were elevated in their eyes. So you at least have one stream, one stripe or variety of what we call Second Temple Judaism. Consider this, a canonical work. And before we move on from that point, I think the audience needs to realize that Second Temple period or intertestamental Judaism is a lot like saying the word Christianity today. There is no one of those. Right. There's not as much variety as if you use the word Christian today, because you've got your three main branches, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and then, underneath all of those, we get to splinter them, so you've got dozens and dozens of things that are Christian. Wasn't quite that situation, but you got a good 4 or 5. Going on in the intertestamental period. So there is no one Judaism. So we have to realize that, but there was at least one of those, one strand that considered Enoch, as part of their sacred texts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm curious, too, about the original writer's view of ancient history and eschatology, what that was and how it compares or contrasts with our own. So, for example, in chapter 39, it says, in those days, the elect and holy children will descend from the high heaven, and their seed will become one with the children of men. Now, is that an event that would have been future from Enoch's time, meaning that it points towards Genesis 6, or is this something from the future, to what would be the future of the writer in the 2nd century or 1st or whenever it was written. And in either case, how do we make sense of who the elect and holy children are?
Yeah, well, since they are elect and holy, this would be something, future. It wouldn't be Genesis 6 because that's about as far as you could get from elect and holy.
Right.
So, and really what it refers to is it refers to, and I'm going to use biblical lingo now. It refers to the restoration of Eden, because Eden, again, I wrote a lot about this in Unseen Realm. The whole Edenic plan was, God's, supernatural family, as it were, the heavenly host, coming to earth with him, in this place, called Eden, that God creates humans. And the whole idea is that God is going to come to man, dwell with him, and they're going to be there too. So we have this blended family kind of thing, supernatural and human, all in the same place, all together. And the idea would have been that if there had been no fall or no rebellion, this is the way life was supposed to be. Humans were supposed to be fit for sacred space out of the gate. And I think we can conclude, because of where the story ends, that eventually we would have been either glorified to be more like them or something like that. But this was the intention, to have this blended family thing. So the line in Enoch really is a lot like what you get in the New Testament, in New Eden, new creation, the global Eden thing, the way the book of Revelation ends, where you have again, you have this re-merging. You have humans joining the celestial family, and so on and so forth. In Unseen Realm, the way I put this is that the human believers replace what was lost in all these rebellions. Again, we become the reconstituted council. You got Hebrews 2, you've got Hebrews 12. Everybody stops at the first verse for Hebrews 12. The cloud of witnesses. Well, if we keep reading, it's this gathering of festal, angels. There's a lot more to it, than that. But Eden is brought back full circle, and this was the original plan. And so that's why, our sanctification ends with this being part of the picture, that we become, regrafted into this. And this is the Enochian way, of expressing the same idea at the time of the end. So again, just that little bit, there's a point of consistency that's very clear, between this book and material in the New Testament. So again, it just goes to defy this notion, because people tend to dismiss Enoch and other, Second Temple literature. Well, where is it quoted? I want to see a quote. Well, okay. I if I was a mean, nasty person, I would want to see where the New Testament quotes explicitly the Old Testament. About half the quotations we think we have are not explicit, but they're allusions and they're clear. So it's the same kind of thing going on. You don't have to give the chapter and verse reference for people who know the material to know what you're thinking when you're using that line or that phrase or that imagery. They know where they're tracking, because they're familiar, with the whole scope of it. So I think it's important, generally, but we could, if we want to get into some apologetic value, I think especially this section is really useful in a very specific apologetics way when it comes to Messiah. But I'm going to let you drive. I'll stay in my lane.
Oh yeah, I definitely do have a question about that. Just to put a cap on this one. So when it says, their seed will become one with the children of men, that's not what we're thinking of, like some kind of mating, between, humanity and us and our resurrected bodies, because
right.
Jesus said there's no marriage.
The term seed doesn't refer to copulation. It refers to the result of copulation. In other words, these guys are going to, this family is going to be mixed with that family. They're both seed. They're both the result of, creation.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. In chapter 40, you had mentioned angels, and in chapter 40 we actually get a glimpse of the importance of angels in really all throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we find it a lot in Enoch. It talks about these four presences, and as we discover, the names for these angels are Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Phanuel, if I'm saying that right. Would these be the same as the four cherubim from Ezekiel? Would the writer be drawing from that, or the living creatures in Revelation? And why were angels so important to those in the first century who followed the Dead Sea Scroll writings?
Yeah, I don't really see any correlation with the cherubim of Ezekiel. I mean, to be honest with you, an archangel would be of much higher rank,
Right.
than a throne guardian, that sort of thing. So, plus, if you actually read the passage, there's very little to suggest that. It would. That's a nice way of saying there's nothing to suggest that. I mean, you'd at least want some, sort of connection other than, there's 4 of those, except where there's not. I mean, there are other places in Enoch where the number is different. You actually get 7, and this goes back to the sections and authorship and authorial hands, and because the number is not always consistent. Sometimes it's 7, but the big 4 here are clearly listed, but I don't see a connection back. I think this is they have ruling authority, and the cherubim would not.
Exactly, and that kind of ties in with your previous book, Angels, and how this denotes more their jobs or their what they're supposed to do rather than like their species or whatever.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting though, because some of them in Enoch get very specific jobs. It's not just hierarchical language, because some of the archangels are selected out to do specific things. So on the podcast, we're doing a series on the use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Okay, mm-hmm. So we're at Revelation. I think we just recorded or are going to record chapter 9. Oh, nice. And it's interesting. There's this whole debate over. Okay, you get to Revelation 9:1, you get the angel with the key. He has the key to the bottomless pit, and so on and so forth. So is that the same one as over in Revelation 20 verse 1? And but the real question is this a good guy or a bad guy? Right. Well, the most obvious candidate though is Uriel from the book of Enoch, because he is actually described as being the angel over Tartarus. Okay, which is the pit. That's Peter's terminology. For the angels that sinned. The watchers in Enoch and Enochian language. So he's the most obvious candidate. So we'll get into that when we record that session. But it's a good example of how you go from this general job description to this is also in your job description. So hope you're good at this.
It'd be weird if he wasn't good at it. It's like, well, Lord, you know me better than anybody. Why would you have me do this when you created me to not be good at this? You had mentioned a good apologetic tool in the second parable, which is chapters 45 through 57. We see focus shift to this Messiah figure that you mentioned, who's the one that judges sinners. And the interesting thing is, like you alluded to, is that we're always taught in church that no Jew ever at any time ever really understood who the Messiah would be or what he would be doing or anything about him, and it was a total mystery until Jesus came. But the book of Enoch seems to tell a much different story, as do much of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What was the expectation of the Messiah within different Jewish factions just before the time of Christ, and why did the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to paint a picture of the Messiah that seems really similar to Jesus?
Yeah, again, because there were multiple sects of Judaism, not everybody's expectations, were identical. So, that's the first thing out of the gate, because they're all looking at the same source. They're looking at the Hebrew Bible, and they're looking at a mass of data points. And so the question is, okay, we've got all this scattered information about this deliverer guy, the servant, Mashiach, all these different terms. So how do we put this together and create a profile? And we know, having read the New Testament, that the New Testament writers will use Old Testament passages in ways that are quite unexpected to us. And what people don't realize is that some of those ways would have been quite unexpected to certain, sects of Judaism at the time. But there were other sects of Judaism that really tracked on it. Now that's a little bit of a convoluted way of saying this. You're right that, and it's typically Christmas or Easter. We get treated to the History Channel special, or the MSLSD or something. The Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history. These specials basically that are so woefully underinformed. But they're designed to create this hermeneutic of suspicion that the Jesus of the Gospels, really, that isn't what was described in the Old Testament. So this stuff that Christians believe must be made up later. That's where it's going with this. The magazines on the impulse shelf, the whole bit. There's this Jesus of history, and then there's the Christ that the church made up. But Enoch and other books, but especially Enoch and especially this section, really defies that. You can't coherently say things like the interpretive spin that the New Testament writers have on this or that passage is totally unique and made up, because it's not. You can find all of their trajectories somewhere in Second Temple Judaism. Okay, we might have one strand that tracked on one or two, and then another strand doesn't track on those two, but they track on another one here. So the New Testament writers are actually, they're going to align with different Jewish outlooks, the 4 or 5 different outlooks. And the one where you get the most hits, as it were, is the Enochian trajectory, the Enochian strand here, and some of the most important stuff like pre-existence. This is an idea that clearly, if you think the Messiah was around before there was a world, well, then the chances are pretty high that you're looking at a divine being here. I mean, how else can you parse that? And that's one of those things that, this is something that the church invented later. Like First Enoch 48. If I was on an interview yesterday, and I said, look, all the Watcher Genesis 6 stuff, that gets all the press, okay? But if there's one passage in Enoch that is of value for Christians, it's this one, and it's First Enoch 48. So it's the Son of Man, which ought to be real familiar, okay? So in that place, Enoch says, I saw the fountain of righteousness, which was inexhaustible, and around it were many fountains of wisdom. So he's having this vision of the dwelling of God. And all the thirsty drank of them and were filled with wisdom, and their dwellings were with the righteous and holy and elect. And at that hour, that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, God, and his name before the head of days. Again, that's very similar to Ancient of Days. Verse 3, yea, before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. So essentially the Son of Man gets his, is tasked, okay, before, before humans were created. I mean, really at the dawn of creation. So there you go. I mean, Son of Man is the title used most of the time in Enoch for the Messiah figure. And it's also, Jesus' favorite title for himself. So think of it this way. If I'm somebody living out in the desert, with this Qumran group, and it's like, we're out here, we're expecting, they were expecting the Messiah. And you talked about eschatology before. Everybody had their own eschatological system. And the one at Qumran, the Essenes, is the only one that sort of fits the window into which Jesus was born, which is really interesting because they believed in 100 cycles of Jubilees, 4,900 years, and they did their math, based on that with a 364-day calendar, and it has this window, from like 10 BC to 6 AD or something like that, where the Messiah was supposed to happen. So if you're out there in the desert, you're thinking this, and all of a sudden you hear about this guy Jesus, and you hear about the miracles, and you hear like when he was born, and you just hear stuff that people are saying about him. You're probably thinking, maybe we were right. Like, when's my day off? I gotta go. I gotta go hear this guy. When's can I have a hall pass out of the desert because I need to go check this guy out. And there are a number of things about the Qumran lifestyle and their theology, and again their reverence for Enoch and the content of Enoch that leads a number of scholars to wonder that it seems reasonable to think that a lot of the people who would have been of this community would have followed, would have become Jesus followers because of all these different things. Because he's out there, oh yeah, you got to go hear this guy. You know what his favorite title for himself is? Son of Man. Isn't that funny? Again, if you're the guy from Qumran, you're probably sitting there thinking, that's not really funny.
Yeah.
That In fact, it's a little scary, because like if this is the guy, again, we're expecting we're all doomed here. Whose side are we on? Because you're expecting that this messianic arrival, and again, you're thinking day of the Lord. That's what you're thinking, which isn't terribly comforting. They're thinking day of the Lord, which again isn't a warm and fuzzy thought, because of all the, it's the apocalypse, it's judgment and whatnot. So I find it really hard to believe that if you're somebody who had this theology, again, that's reflected in Enoch, and this is the community that revered Enoch and took care of a lot of these texts, that when you hear this stuff, you just conclude, can't be him, can't be the guy. I would think the exact opposite is true. That it's like, holy cow, we maybe we're right, because again of their whole eschatological system and just the messianic stuff in the book. I mean, they're going to know this. They're going to know this material, and it's going to at the very least draw attention. So the idea that this is all post-Christian invention, this sort of the supernatural elements or the divine elements with the Messiah. People who claim that have never read 1 Enoch 48 and other passages in the book, and frankly other things in other books. It's like you might as well just put a disclaimer on your show that says, we're hopelessly uninformed and ignorant. Please watch our show, because the claims just don't match the data. But again, they're not interested in data. They're interested in driving this wedge, between, like I said, the quote unquote Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, because that just serves a greater agenda.
Yeah, I agree. And anytime I see anything from those channels, it really makes that obvious. I want to ask you if there's any way we can know if Jesus had direct interactions with the Qumran community in any way. And we do have a lot more to talk about too. We got to talk about wisdom, and you mentioned these books. I want to get a little bit more into that and the angels, much more. But before we do, Mike, if people want to get your book and find you online, where can they do that?
Yeah, the Nerve Center is dr, as in doctor, msh.com, drmsh.com. All the books you can find on Amazon, but, for the blog and links to other things, that I'm into, the podcast, Fringe Pop, the YouTube channel, you can find links right there. So that's the easy place to go. But I was smart enough to actually get domain names that that match the titles of what we do. So nakedbiblepodcast.com, fringepop.com, and YouTube, just type in fringepop321, you're going to find it. So those are the places to go.
Excellent. I highly suggest that people do. All right, we're going to pick the rest of this conversation up in the members only section of this video, which you can find at dailyrenegade.com. Just get a membership or get a free trial and check out the rest of our interview over there. If you're already a member, hang on the line. Everyone else, thank you so much. Take care and God bless.